The German Shepherd wouldn't let a single person touch him. Not the ER attending, not the charge nurse, not the security guard who tried to grab his collar and nearly lost 3 fingers. The dog, a 90-pound military working animal with a wound bleeding through his front leg, stood over the old man on the gurney and showed his teeth to every white coat in the room. Everyone froze. Then a young woman in light blue scrubs walked through the crowd, knelt down on the dirty ER floor, and said something quiet, something nobody else caught. The dog stopped growling. He lowered his head, and he let her work. 8 minutes later, 4 black military SUVs tore into the parking lot of Carver Regional Medical Center, and the people who had just fired that nurse started to understand exactly what they had done. If this story already has you hooked, do me a favor, hit follow so you don't miss what happens next. Drop a like if you want to see justice land hard, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The call came in at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, and nobody at Carver Regional Medical Center in Delwood, Montana was prepared for what walked through those doors. The ambulance bay radio had said elderly male, possible cardiac episode stable. What it didn't mention was the dog. The German Shepherd came in on a leash attached to a man named Wallace Pruitt, 71 years old, built like someone had stacked cinder blocks under loose skin, and moving with the careful stiffness of a person who'd broken most of the bones in his body at least once. He walked under his own power, barely, one hand gripping the intake desk and the other wrapped around the leash of an animal that was bleeding from a gash above his left foreleg. Not dripping, bleeding. A steady, dark line running down the dog's leg and leaving a trail across the linoleum. He got clipped by a piece of metal off the truck, the old man said. His voice was flat and controlled in a way that didn't come from calm. It came from experience. I think it needs stitching. The dog, I'm fine. Just dizzy. The intake coordinator, a young woman named Petra, who had been on shift for 40 minutes and had not yet had coffee, looked at the man, looked at the dog, and looked back at the man. Sir, this is a human medical facility. I know what it is. We don't treat animals here. Wallace Pruitt didn't argue. He just stood there, holding the leash, and the dog stood next to him with blood running down his leg, and the two of them looked at the desk with the same expression, patient, exhausted, and deeply accustomed to being told no. I'll wait, the old man said, and lowered himself into a chair. The dog sat beside him and put his head on the man's knee. Okay. It was Nora Kessler who noticed them first. She'd come off a 12-hour overnight and was supposed to be clocking out. She'd made it as far as the locker room hallway before doubling back for the travel mug she'd left at the nursing station. And on her way through the waiting room, she saw the old man in the chair and the dog beside him, with its leg wrapped in a piece of the man's flannel shirt, torn off at the shoulder, which explained why the old man was wearing a shirt with one sleeve. She was 29. Brown hair pulled back tight. A face that didn't do much with its expressions unless something was actually happening, and right now something was actually happening. She crossed the waiting room without stopping to think about whether she should. How long has he been bleeding like that? Wallace looked up. He took his time measuring her. Since about 5 this morning. She looked at the dog. The dog looked at her. He didn't growl, but he didn't soften either. He tracked her with yellow-brown eyes that were watchful and tired, and very, very serious. Can I look at it? You can try, the old man said. He doesn't take to strangers much. Nora didn't crouch down fast or reach out her hand or do any of the things people did when they were performing calmness for an animal. She just sat down on the floor, cross-legged, about 3 feet from the dog, and waited. The dog's ears shifted. She said something, low, under her breath, and the words weren't clear to anyone nearby, not Petra at the desk, not the man in the corner pretending to read a magazine. It wasn't baby talk. It wasn't soothing nonsense. It sounded like an instruction, delivered quietly, the way you'd talk to someone who understood you. The dog's posture changed. Not dramatically. Just, the tension came out of his shoulders. His head dropped half an inch. He let her move closer. She unwrapped the flannel carefully, found the wound, and her face did something then, not alarm but a focused kind of stillness. She pressed her fingers gently around the edges of the cut. It's deep but clean. He needs irrigation and closure. If he doesn't get it in the next few hours, there's going to be infection. I know, Wallace said. You drove here? 40 minutes. With your arm like that? She'd noticed the way he was holding his right arm. Not injured, just compensating. Old damage, shoulder probably. Didn't have a choice. He said it without self-pity. Nora stood up. I'm going to talk to someone. Yeah. The someone she talked to was Dr. Harrison Boyle, and the conversation lasted approximately 90 seconds. Boyle was the attending on duty, mid-50s, the kind of physician who'd built his entire professional identity around the word protocol, and who treated any deviation from written procedure as a personal affront. He had a long face and small eyes, and the permanently pressured expression of a man who had been running behind schedule since 2008. Absolutely not, he said, before Nora finished her sentence. The wound needs closure. The dog isn't aggressive. This is a hospital, not a veterinary clinic. Whatever's out there, the owner needs to take it to an appropriate facility. The nearest animal hospital is 40 miles from here. The dog's been bleeding for over an hour. That's not our problem. She looked at him for a moment. The veteran looks dizzy. He drove 40 minutes with a head injury or cardiac. Then we'll treat the veteran. We are not treating a dog. He straightened his coat. And if you've been out there handling that animal, you need to wash your hands and glove up before you touch anything in my ER. Is that clear? It was clear. She went back out to the waiting room. Wallace Pruitt was still in the chair. The dog, she'd heard the old man call him Rex, not as a command, but just as a name, the way you say someone's name when you want them to know you see them, was still beside him, still bleeding, though the improvised bandage had been retied. They won't help him, Nora said. She didn't dress it up. No, the old man said. He didn't sound surprised. She looked at Rex. Rex looked back at her with those careful, serious eyes. I can try to do something basic out here. I'm a nurse. I don't have veterinary training, but I know how to clean and close a wound. She paused. I could lose my job for it. Wallace looked at her for a long moment. Then don't. I'm going to anyway. She went to get supplies. What she brought back was minimal. What she could pull from a trauma cart without triggering a formal requisition. Saline irrigation, wound closure strips, gauze, a pair of scissors. Not ideal. Workable. She sat back down on the floor. Rex watched her lay out each item with the same focused attention he'd given everything else. Not threatening, just cataloging. When she moved toward him with the saline, she spoke again, the same low register as before, and again it worked in a way that was hard to explain. The dog stayed still. Not drugged still, or fear still. Cooperative. She irrigated the wound. Rex flinched once, hard, and made a sound low in his throat, but he didn't move. She cleaned it, assessed the depth, and applied the closure strips in 3 careful rows, while Wallace watched with his hands folded between his knees. He's not a pet, is he? She said. Not a question. No. Working dog? The old man was quiet for a second. Was. She finished with the gauze and secured it. Rex sniffed the bandage and looked at her, and then, in a move she wasn't expecting, he put his nose against the back of her hand. Just briefly. Then he looked away. He doesn't do that, Wallace said. His voice had changed slightly. Something had shifted in it. Do what? That. She started repacking the supplies. He's going to need antibiotics, real veterinary care within 24 hours. I'll get him there. And you need to be looked at, seriously. I'm fine. You've said that twice. Before he could answer, the door from the ER hallway swung open hard enough to hit the doorstop. Dr. Harrison Boyle had not come alone. He had 2 nurses flanking him, and behind them the administrative duty officer for the morning shift, a woman named Sandra Fitch, who wore her lanyard like a weapon and had never once in her career made a decision that wasn't pre-approved in writing. Boyle walked straight to Nora and stopped 3 feet short, which was close enough to make a point and far enough to stay out of Rex's line of sight. What exactly do you think you're doing? Nora stood up. She was shorter than him by several inches, and she didn't do anything about that. Cleaning a wound. On a dog, in my waiting room, using hospital supplies. On a patient's animal, in the waiting area, using materials that I will account for personally. You don't have authorization. There's no policy that specifically prohibits. There is now. He turned to Sandra Fitch. Document this. Fitch already had her tablet out. Wallace Pruitt had not moved from his chair. He was watching all of it with the patient, measuring look of someone who had spent years reading situations fast and deciding when to act and when to wait. He was still waiting. Boyle turned back to Nora. You're done here. Go wait in the staff office. I'm off shift. I don't technically. Then you're even less authorized to be doing what you're doing. Get out of this area or I'll have security escort you. The waiting room had gone completely quiet. 6 or 7 other people in chairs, watching. Petra at the desk, watching. One of the flanking nurses looking at the floor. Nora gathered the remaining supplies. She didn't rush. She didn't say anything else to Boyle. She crouched back down for a second, and she looked at Rex, and she said something to him. Another one of those low, quiet sentences, and he made a small sound in the back of his throat. Then she straightened up and walked toward the hallway door. Boyle followed her 3 steps, lowered his voice. You're going to be written up for misuse of resources, unauthorized patient interaction, and failure to follow protocol. You understand that? I understand that, she said. That's a terminable offense. She looked at him. Her expression didn't collapse or harden. It just stayed even, the way still water stays even. Then you should terminate me, she said, and went through the door. The termination took 45 minutes. She sat in an administrative office that smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee, while Sandra Fitch typed, and a man from HR, whose name she immediately forgot, read from a paper, and Dr. Boyle sat at the head of the table and did not look at her once. Hospital Director Preston Hale arrived halfway through and signed the paperwork without asking her a single question. Effective immediately, Sameb, he said. Your access badge will be deactivated. You can collect personal belongings under escort. I'd like to check on the veteran first. That's not your concern anymore. She nodded. They gave her a box for her locker. A security guard walked her through the hallway. Her coworkers watched from stations and doorways, some with sympathy, some with something closer to relief. Nothing that felt like solidarity. In the box, a photograph of her sister's kids taped to the inside of her locker door, a spare set of scrub pants, a half-eaten granola bar, a folded piece of paper she didn't look at until she was in the parking lot. It was a patient note, written in cramped capital letters, left in her locker sometime in the last week. Thank you for listening. No name. She folded it back up and put it in her jacket pocket. The morning was cold and still, the way Montana mornings were in October. Not brutal yet, but getting there. The parking lot was half full, ordinary cars and a delivery truck idling near the supply entrance. And Nora stood there with her box and her coat and thought about what she was going to do next. She didn't get long to think about it. The sound started before she could see the source. A low building frequency, tires on asphalt moving fast. Then they came around the corner of the hospital's main drive. 4 black SUVs, no markings, moving with the precise spacing of vehicles that had practiced this. They didn't park. They stopped. Engines running, formation tight, and the doors opened, and the people who stepped out were not police, not federal agents and windbreakers, not any category of official she'd seen pull into a hospital parking lot before. They were military, dressed down, no insignia visible, but the way they moved said everything that the clothes didn't. The one who came around the front of the lead vehicle was older, 60s maybe. Silver at the temples, posture like someone had built him around a steel rod. He scanned the parking lot with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent his life being the first one to assess a room. His eyes landed on Nora. He stopped. And Nora, standing in the parking lot with a cardboard box of her belongings, went very still, because she knew his face. And from the way his expression shifted, recognition arriving fast and hard, he knew hers. His name was Brigadier General Marcus Vale, and the last time Nora Kessler had seen him, she'd been lying face down in a drainage ditch in a country she was not officially in, with 2 broken ribs and a field radio that had stopped working 40 minutes earlier. That had been 6 years ago. He crossed the parking lot at a pace that wasn't hurrying but covered ground fast anyway, and he stopped 2 feet from her and looked at her the way people look at things they weren't sure they'd see again. Kessler. Sir? He looked at the box in her hands. He looked at the deactivated badge clipped to the side of it. His jaw moved slightly, the way it did when he was processing something that annoyed him, which she remembered from briefings and from the back of transport vehicles, and from one very long night in a forward operating base when he'd sat across from her and told her, carefully and without drama, that her team hadn't made it out. "How long have you been here?" he said. "Carver Regional, 14 months. As a nurse." As a nurse. He looked at the badge again. "They fired you." It wasn't a question, but she answered it. "About an hour ago." Something moved through his expression. It wasn't sympathy exactly. It was closer to the specific anger of someone who has just arrived too late to stop something. "For treating the dog. For using hospital supplies without authorization." He took the box out of her hands, just reached over and took it, tucked it under his arm like it weighed nothing, and said, "Come with me." But she didn't ask where they were going. She'd learned a long time ago that with Vale, the destination became clear faster if you just moved and let the context fill itself in. He walked her to the lead SUV, handed the box to someone standing near the rear vehicle, a young staff sergeant who took it with both hands and didn't ask questions, and then Vale turned and looked at the hospital entrance. "He's inside?" "Wallace? Yes, they were going to treat him, just not the dog." "Rex, he told you." "Wallace has been trying to reach someone since 5 this morning. His phone was giving him trouble." Vale said it without accusation, but there was an edge underneath it, the kind that came from knowing that if communication had worked the way it was supposed to, this whole situation would have unfolded differently. "Where's Rex now?" "Waiting room, last I saw. I bandaged the leg, but he needs real veterinary attention." Vale turned to the nearest of his people, a woman, compact, with close-cropped hair and the watchful stillness of someone who spent most of her time listening. "Hendricks." "Sir?" "Get the kit from Vehicle 3 and follow her description to the waiting room. Don't announce anything. Don't escalate. Just find the dog and assess." Hendricks moved. Vale looked back at Nora. "Walk me through what you did." She did. Concisely, saline irrigation, wound closure strips, gauze, no suturing because she didn't have the right materials and wasn't sure of the wound depth, instruction to get him to a vet within 24 hours. Vale listened with his arms crossed and his eyes on the hospital entrance, asking 2 questions. What was the wound location, and had Rex shown any signs of disorientation? "Left foreleg, just above the joint." And no, he was alert the whole time, tired but tracking. "Good." He uncrossed his arms. "You spoke to him in German." She was quiet for a second. "I don't know what you mean." "The thing you said to calm him. It was German. One of the staff inside said they couldn't make out the words. I used a calm tone. Dogs respond to Nora." He said her name the way he'd said it in briefings when she was hedging. Just her name, flat, with no punctuation needed. Rex is trained in German command protocol. He was deployed overseas for 3 years before Wallace retired him. He does not respond to tone. He responds to command words. He looked at her. "So." The parking lot was quiet except for wind moving across the lot and the distant sound of Hendrick's bootsteps disappearing through the hospital's automatic doors. "I remembered some things," she said, "from the program. From before." He let that sit. He knew when not to push, which had always been one of the things that made him harder to manage than commanding officers who just yelled. Inside the hospital, things were already moving in a direction nobody had planned for. Hendricks walked through the waiting room entrance with the field kit and found Rex in the same chair position Nora had left him, Wallace still beside him, and approximately 9 civilians pretending not to stare. She crouched in front of Rex and spoke 2 words quietly, and Rex looked at her with his serious eyes and remained still while she cut away the bandage and examined the wound underneath. She was good. Her movements were efficient without being cold, and she took about 90 seconds before she sat back on her heels and looked at Wallace. "She did clean work," she said. "I know," he said. "He's going to need sutures and a course of antibiotics. We have both in the vehicle." She looked at him directly. "How are you?" I already told the other one I'm fine. And I'm asking again. Wallace's mouth compressed slightly. Dizzy. Was dizzy. It passed. When did it start? Sometime before 5. Any chest tightness? A pause that ran 2 counts too long. Some. Hendricks pulled her radio. Outside, Vale got the transmission and turned to the nearest staff member. Get the medical bag from Vehicle 2, and tell Dr. Reyes to come up from Vehicle 4. Nora watched all of this, the controlled deployment of people and resources, the way each person received instruction and moved without the small lag of hesitation that showed up in most workplaces, and felt something shift in her chest. Not nostalgia, something older than that. The particular comfort of watching a well-trained unit work, which was a feeling she'd spent 14 months trying to make herself stop missing. He could have died, she said. Not accusation, just arithmetic. He could have, Vale said. If I hadn't been there, or if I'd followed protocol and stayed away from Rex, he still would have been in that chair, and the chest pain would have gotten worse. He looked at her. You made the right call. The hospital disagrees. The hospital, Vale said, is about to disagree with a lot of things. He said it quietly, without heat, which made it land harder than if he'd shouted it. Dr. Harrison Boyle became aware that something had changed when he walked back through the waiting room and found a uniformed woman crouched beside the dog with a medical field kit open on the floor, and a silver-haired man in civilian clothes standing near the entrance, talking to the nurse he had fired 40 minutes ago. He stopped. His first instinct was the one that had carried him this far in his career, protocol enforcement. This was his ER. These people had not checked in. The woman with the field kit was performing what appeared to be veterinary care on the waiting room floor, which was a liability issue, a hygiene issue, and possibly 3 separate violations of facility regulations. He walked toward her. Excuse me, you can't. Captain Hendricks, Army Medical Corps. She didn't look up. You can finish that sentence if you want, but I'd suggest directing your concerns to Brigadier General Vale, who's just outside. Boyle stopped. Hendricks kept working. Boyle turned around and walked through the automatic doors into the parking lot, and the first person he saw was Preston Hale, the hospital director, who had come outside for some reason Boyle couldn't account for and was now standing near the entrance with his arms crossed and his face doing something complicated. The second person he saw was Vale. The third was Nora Kessler, standing next to Vale with no box in her hands and an expression that was not triumphant, not satisfied, just even. Boyle straightened. I don't know who you people are, but this is a private medical facility, and you don't have the right to— Harrison Boyle, Vale said. Not a question. Dr. Boyle? Yes. You're the attending who refused treatment to a patient this morning. I refused treatment to an animal that had no business being in— Wallace Pruitt, Vale said, and something in the way he said the name made Boyle stop. Sergeant First Class, retired. 3 tours, 2 of them special operations. He was awarded the Silver Star in 2003 and the Distinguished Service Cross in 2007. He arrived at your facility this morning with a cardiac event in progress and a working animal in his care, and your staff's primary concern was the dog's presence in the waiting room. We treated Mr. Pruitt. He has been in that waiting room for over an hour with chest tightness and dizziness while your staff argued about a dog. Vale's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. One of your nurses acted correctly. You terminated her for it. Hale had gone very still. Boyle opened his mouth, closed it. Rex, Vale continued, is a retired military working dog who was assigned to Sergeant Pruitt upon retirement as part of a formal placement program. He is not a pet. His care falls under a Department of Defense protocol that, frankly, it would have taken you about 4 minutes to look up if someone had thought to ask the question instead of just deciding. He paused. Nobody asked. We had no way of knowing. You had a veteran in your waiting room. That was enough information. He let that land. My medical officer is with Sergeant Pruitt now. If he needs to be moved, we'll move him. In the meantime, I'd like to speak with whoever is responsible for personnel decisions here. Hale's hand went up, slow, like a man in a meeting who already knows the answer isn't going to help him. That would be me. Preston Hale, Director. Mr. Hale. Vale looked at him with the measured attention of someone filing information away for later. We have things to discuss. The next 2 hours moved the way things moved when institutional inertia collided with something that outranked it, slowly at first, then all at once. Wallace Pruitt was moved from the waiting room to an actual examination room, where a Carver regional cardiologist was now doing his job with the focused attention of someone who understood that other people were watching. His vitals had stabilized. The chest tightness, Hendricks reported, had likely been a stress response layered over dehydration, and the cumulative effect of 40 minutes in a vehicle with a bleeding animal he was afraid for. He was not in immediate danger. But he'd been close enough to it that the word close was still doing work in the sentences people were using. Rex was sutured and bandaged properly in the parking lot on a foam pad Hendricks produced from the Vehicle 3 kit, with Dr. Reyes, who turned out to be a veterinarian attached to the K9 unit, which apparently was a thing that existed, handling the procedure while Rex submitted to it with the same serious, watchful cooperation he'd shown Nora. Nora herself sat in the back of Vehicle 1 with the door open and her feet on the asphalt and a paper cup of coffee someone had produced from a thermos, and she watched all of it without being asked to do anything or explain anything or justify herself to anyone, which felt strange after the last 2 hours of her life. Vale came and sat beside her after a while. Not across from her, beside her, in the open doorway of the SUV, which meant they were both looking out at the parking lot. "You changed your name," he said. "I moved." "Montana." "I like the cold." "You hate the cold." "You complained about it every single winter rotation." She wrapped both hands around the paper cup. "I got used to it." He didn't push that either. He had a particular talent for knowing which threads to pull and which to leave. "There are going to be questions," he said, "from my side, about the technique you used with Rex, about what you remembered and how." "I know." "You don't have to answer them here." She looked at the hospital entrance. Through the glass doors she could see, distantly, the waiting room, the chairs where Wallace had sat, the floor where she'd knelt with the saline and the gauze. Sandra Fitch was somewhere in there with her tablet and her documentation of Nora's termination. Dr. Boyle was somewhere in there adjusting his understanding of this morning. "I left for reasons," she said. "I know." "Those reasons haven't changed." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. "Nobody's asking you to go back to what you were. I'm just here because Wallace called and Rex needed someone who could reach him, and the one person in a 50-mile radius who apparently could reach him got fired for it." He paused. "That's what I'm here about." Inside the hospital, visible through the glass, Preston Hale was walking down the corridor with two people Nora didn't recognize. Administrative type, moving with the energy of people who had just been pulled into something they needed to get ahead of. "They're going to try to contain it," she said. "They're going to try," Vale agreed. "It won't work." "Why not?" "Because there are 4 vehicles full of people in their parking lot and a retired special operations veteran who is currently having a cardiac workup in their ER because they left him in the waiting room for an hour." He looked at her. "And because there's security footage. There always is." She thought about that. About the camera above the waiting room entrance, the one she'd noticed on her 3rd week of work, because she had a habit of noticing cameras. The angle would have caught all of it. Rex, Wallace, the crowd that gathered, Dr. Boyle's entrance, her crouching on the floor, the words spoken. All of it, time-stamped. "The footage shows what I said to Rex," she said. "Yes." "If someone reviews it carefully, yes." She was quiet. "Nora," he said, "how long did you think this was going to stay quiet?" She looked at the cup in her hands. The coffee had gone lukewarm while she wasn't paying attention. "I thought I had more time," she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said all morning. Vale didn't respond immediately. He looked out at the parking lot, at the SUVs, at Hendricks talking to one of the other staff members near Vehicle 3, at the ordinary cars around them that belonged to ordinary people doing ordinary things. "There's a reporter," he said, "local. She was already monitoring police band when the call came in about the veteran. She's parked across the street." Nora turned. She could see it now, a white sedan in the lot across the road, and the faint shape of someone inside with something raised toward the windshield. "How long has she been there?" 18 minutes. "What does she have so far?" Vehicles, numbers, Wallace being moved on a gurney, Rex on the foam pad. He paused. You and me talking. Nora set the coffee cup on the floor of the SUV. She's going to pull the public records, she said. Wallace's service record is public. The Silver Star, the DSC, that's public. If she connects that to the hospital refusing to help, she already has Wallace's name. One of the intake staff confirmed it when she called posing as a family member. He said it without judgment. She's good. How much time do we have before this is on the news? Not much. Inside the hospital, Hale had stopped in the middle of the corridor. He was looking at his phone. Whatever was on the screen had made him go still in the specific way that people went still when something had already happened that they could no longer stop. Nora watched him through the glass. She thought about the 14 months of carefully ordinary life she'd built here. The apartment with the secondhand couch, the coworkers she'd learned to have lunch with, the patients who left notes in her locker. She thought about how much work it had taken to make herself small enough to fit inside a life that nobody would look at too closely. She thought about Wallace in the waiting room, holding Rex's leash, and the way he'd said, "I know," when she told him they wouldn't help. The resignation of someone who had stopped being surprised by that answer. She thought about what she'd said to Rex. The specific words. The ones that required specific training to know. The white sedan across the road hadn't moved. Vale was still beside her, not pushing, not performing patience, just actually patient, the way people were when they'd been in enough situations to know that some things needed to arrive in their own time. She's going to find out who I am, Nora said. Probably. All of it. Maybe not all, but enough. She looked at him. Is that why you came yourself? Instead of sending someone? He held her gaze. I came because Wallace called and Rex was hurt, and you were the one who helped them and got fired for it. That's the whole story. She almost believed him. The hospital's automatic doors opened, and Preston Hale walked back out into the parking lot with his phone still in his hand and the particular expression of a man preparing to do something he already knew was going to go wrong. And behind him, 3 steps back, came Dr. Harrison Boyle. And Boyle was looking at Nora in a way he hadn't looked at her before. Not with the administrative authority he'd carried all morning. With the look of someone who had just finished reading something and understood for the first time that he had made a significant mistake. He stopped walking. Nora watched him. And then his phone rang, and he looked down at it, and the name on the screen, whatever it was, made the remaining color go out of his face. He answered it. Nora watched his face while he listened, and what she saw wasn't the slow crumple of a man receiving bad news. It was faster than that, more structural, like watching a load-bearing wall take a hit. His expression didn't fall apart. It just stopped working. The professional architecture he'd maintained all morning, the attending physician's authority, the righteous certainty of a man who'd followed his own rules, went somewhere behind his eyes and didn't come back. He said 2 words into the phone. I understand. Then he lowered it. Hale had seen it too. He crossed the distance between them in 4 steps and said something in a low voice that Nora couldn't hear from the SUV doorway. And Boyle answered him, and whatever the answer was, it made Hale's expression do the same collapsing thing. Vale watched all of it from beside her without moving. What was that call? She said. Hospital board, he said. At a guess. Or their legal office. He paused. We made some calls before we drove here. She turned to look at him. Standard procedure, he said, which was Vale's version of, I know that sounds like a lot, but I'm not apologizing for it. You contacted their board before you even arrived. We contacted their board when we understood what had happened, which was about 40 minutes ago. He looked at her steadily. Wallace called us at 5. It took time to get people moving, get vehicles, drive here. We weren't idle while we drove. She thought about that. About the board receiving a call from a Brigadier General's office before anyone at the hospital even knew military vehicles were coming. About Boyle checking his phone in the parking lot and finding whatever he found there. The legal office, a board member, someone telling him that the attending physician who'd fired a nurse for treating a military working dog was now the subject of an inquiry that had been initiated before lunch. You already knew what happened, she said. You knew before you talked to me. I knew the outline. Wallace told us what he saw. He glanced at her. He was very specific about the nurse who helped them. She didn't say anything to that. He described exactly what you said to Rex, Vale continued. The words, the order. He's worked with K-9 units for 20 years. He knows the protocol, and he knows that what you did wasn't something you learned in nursing school. He let that sit for 2 seconds. He asked us to find out who you were before he even told us his own condition. Nora looked at the hospital entrance where Boyle and Hale were still talking, voices too low to carry, bodies positioned with the collapsed energy of people who had run out of options and hadn't quite accepted it yet. He knew, she said. He suspected. He wanted confirmation. And now you have it. And now we have it, Vale said, which means we need to talk about what comes next. What came next arrived in pieces, the way things did when a situation was too large to land all at once. The first piece was the reporter. Her name was Dana Forsyth, and she worked for the Delwood Courier-Register, which was a regional paper that nobody outside of 3 counties had heard of, but she had a social media following of 40,000 people and a habit of posting video directly to those accounts before her editor had approved anything, a habit her editor hated and had never successfully stopped. She'd been monitoring the police band when the initial call came in. She'd arrived inside 10 minutes, and she'd spent the last 45 recording everything visible from a public lot with a camera that was better than anything a regional paper should technically be able to afford. She walked across the road with it when Hendricks was still finishing up with Rex. She didn't come to the military vehicles first. She went to the hospital entrance, asked for the communications director, was told there wasn't one on site today, and then stood in the lobby for 6 minutes until Preston Hale came out and found her there and made the mistake of telling her that there was nothing to comment on at this time. A decorated special operations veteran arrived here this morning with a cardiac event, she said. Her recorder was already running. He sat in your waiting room for over an hour before anyone did a proper intake. A nurse who attempted to render assistance was terminated. Can you walk me through the hospital's decision-making process there? Hale said, I'm not in a position to discuss personnel matters. The veteran's name is a matter of public record, she said. His service record is public. The Silver Star, the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Purple Hearts, that's all public. The dog with him. Is it accurate that the dog is a retired military working animal? I can't comment on, because if that's accurate, there are Department of Defense guidelines about the care of retired military working dogs. And I'm wondering if your staff was aware of those guidelines when they asked Sergeant Pruitt to remove the animal from the premises. Hale closed his mouth. She waited with the patience of someone who had learned that silence was a better interview tool than the next question. We will be issuing a statement, he said finally. When? This afternoon. I'll be here, she said. Nora knew none of this in real time. She knew it the way she came to know most things that morning, in fragments, through Vale, through what she could see through glass and across parking lots, through the behavior of people whose faces she'd learned to read. What she did know in real time was that Hendricks had finished with Rex, that Dr. Reyes had confirmed the sutures would hold and the antibiotic protocol was started, and that Wallace Pruitt had been moved to a room where a cardiologist was running an EKG that, from what Nora could gather through the reported chain, showed elevated markers consistent with stress-induced cardiac strain, not a full event, but close enough to one that the word close was still doing real work in the sentences people were using. She also knew, because Vale told her directly, that 2 investigators from the Department of Defense had been dispatched and would arrive at Carver Regional before 2 o'clock. What are they investigating? She said. Standard review. Incident involving a retired military working animal and a veteran receiving federally connected care. That's the official framing. That's the accurate framing. And the unofficial framing? He looked at her. You used classified command protocol on a military working dog in a hospital waiting room after 14 months of living under a different name in a town where nobody knew your history. He paused. The unofficial framing is that people have questions. She stood up from the SUV doorway. Stood up fully because sitting had started to feel like a posture she couldn't afford anymore. What kind of questions? The kind that start with, why did you leave, and end with, what aren't you telling us? I told you why I left. You told me you left for reasons. That's not the same thing. He wasn't harsh about it. He was just accurate, which with Vale had always been harder to argue with than harshness. The investigators aren't going to be satisfied with reasons. They're going to want specifics. She crossed her arms. Not defensively, more like she was holding something in place while she figured out what to do with it. The morning had started cold and was still cold, and the wind off the mountains had a bite to it that didn't care about the situation. I will talk to the investigators, she said. Within limits. What limits? The ones that protect people who don't need to be part of this story. He studied her. That's going to depend on what they find in the footage review. I know. Nora, the German commands you used, they're not just training protocol. 2 of them are designation specific, tied to a particular unit's methodology. He let that land. If someone who knows what they're looking at sees that footage, they're going to know not just that you had K9 handling training, they're going to know which program you came out of. The wind moved through the parking lot. Across the road, the white sedan still sat in its spot, and she could see Forsyth now standing outside it, phone to her ear, the camera on the hood pointed at the hospital entrance. Nora thought about the program. She hadn't said the name of it aloud in 6 years, hadn't let herself think about it in anything more than peripheral flashes, the way you learned not to look directly at bright things. It had been a good program, and then it had not been. And the line between those 2 things had been a single night and a decision that she'd made under pressure with incomplete information and still believed on most days was the right one, on most days. If the footage review leads to the program, she said, then the program becomes part of the story. Yes. And the people in it? Possibly. She looked at him. He held the look without moving. Is that why you came yourself? She said again, and this time she let the question carry more weight. Not just because of Wallace, because of what the footage might show and what that opens up. He was quiet for a moment that ran 1 beat longer than his usual pauses. There are people who need to know the story before it becomes public, he said. People who were part of what you were part of. They deserve advance notice. Who sent you, Marcus? It was the first time she'd used his name, and it landed between them differently than Sir had. He held her gaze. I volunteered. That's not what I asked. I know. He looked at the hospital. The deputy director of the program contacted me when the footage review was flagged, 2 hours ago, before we had the vehicles moving. He paused. She wanted me to find you before the investigators did. Nora went very still. She's still in it? She said. She runs it now. The parking lot felt different after that. Not bigger or smaller, just different in the way spaces changed when the information inside them changed. She knows I'm here, Nora said. She's known for 3 months. She didn't tell you because she respected that you wanted distance. Something shifted in his voice. The footage changed the calculation. Because now it's not private. Because now a regional reporter is standing across the road with a camera and a 40,000-person following, and within 24 hours the footage from this waiting room is going to be everywhere. And when people who know what to look for see what you said to that dog, the questions are not going to be small. She looked at the hospital doors. Yet, inside, at roughly this same moment, something was happening that nobody outside had been told about yet. A hospital security supervisor named Ray Culver had been in his office on the 2nd floor since 7 that morning, doing the ordinary things security supervisors did, when his phone showed an internal alert. Administrative request, footage review, waiting room camera, 0630 to 0800. He'd pulled the footage as requested and had been watching it for the last 20 minutes. He was not a man who startled easily. He'd done 8 years in law enforcement before moving to hospital security, and he had a practical, unsentimental relationship with surveillance footage. He knew what it showed and what it didn't, and he was good at not reading more into things than was there. But he'd watched the clip 4 times now. The nurse, Kessler, according to the termination file that had been attached to the footage request, kneeled on the floor with the dog and said something, and the dog's posture changed. He'd watched it 4 times, and the change was not subtle. It was the specific relaxation of an animal receiving a known command from a known authority structure, not the general softening of an animal responding to kindness. He'd seen enough of both to know the difference. He'd also run the audio enhancement twice through the software his office used for incident review, and the second pass had been clear enough. 2 words. Distinct. in a language that wasn't English. He'd sent the clip to an outside contact, a former colleague who'd worked federal K-9 training before retirement, and the response had come back in 11 minutes. Where did this nurse say she worked before? He'd written back, she's a civilian nurse, no listed prior military service in her HR file. The response had taken 4 minutes. That's not a civilian technique. That's a unit-specific designation command. Delta Tier K-9 integration. I haven't heard that used outside a controlled training environment in 6 years. Who is this person? Ray Culver leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about the 4 black SUVs in the parking lot and the silver-haired man in civilian clothes who had taken the cardboard box out of the fired nurse's hands like he'd done it before. He picked up his phone and called the number for the hospital's legal office. By noon, there were 3 separate tracks running simultaneously, and Nora was at the center of all of them without being fully inside anyone. The first was the board inquiry, which had moved faster than boards usually moved. Someone with influence had made calls, and the preliminary finding was that Boyle's termination of Nora had been procedurally irregular and potentially retaliatory, which was the legal office's way of saying we have a problem without saying it plainly. The second was Forsyth, who had posted her first clip at 11:47 and watched it reach 8,000 views in 14 minutes. It was just the outside footage, the SUVs, the activity in the parking lot, a brief shot of Rex on the foam pad, with a caption that asked why 4 military vehicles were outside a Montana hospital and why a nurse had been escorted out with a box of belongings an hour before they arrived. The comments were already running. The third track was the one Nora had known was coming since Vale told her about the deputy director. At 12:23, 2 investigators arrived in a gray government sedan and walked into the hospital without stopping at the desk, which meant someone inside had been expecting them. They were with the hospital for 40 minutes. Then they came outside and walked directly to Vehicle 1, where Vale was waiting, and the 3 of them spoke for 9 minutes with the focused brevity of people who had already agreed on the important things and were working out the details. Then one of them walked across the parking lot to where Nora was standing, near the building's side entrance, where she'd moved when the wind got worse. He was younger than she expected, late 30s, with the particular kind of tired in his eyes that came not from lack of sleep but from carrying too much information for too long. "Ms. Kessler," he said. "That depends," she said, "on which file you're reading from." He almost smiled, not quite. The footage review came back about an hour ago. Full audio enhancement. He held her gaze. "You want to tell me anything before we go through it formally?" She looked past him at the hospital doors. Through the glass, she could see the waiting room, empty now, the chairs rearranged slightly from the morning's activity, the floor where she'd knelt still showing a faint mark where the foam pad had sat. "I want to see Wallace first," she said. "That's not... I need 5 minutes with him. Then I'll answer everything you want to ask." She met his eyes. "He came here for help. He didn't get it for over an hour. I'd like to know he's okay before I sit in a room and answer questions about myself." The investigator looked at her for a moment. He was measuring something, not whether she was a threat, but something more specific. Whether she was the kind of person who made requests like that for tactical reasons, or for human ones. He stepped aside. 5 minutes, he said. "Protect." Wallace's room was on the 2nd floor, which meant passing through the ER corridor, past the nursing station, where 2 of Nora's former co-workers pretended to be busy with things that didn't require them to make eye contact, past the trauma bay where the morning's ordinary emergencies had continued without interruption the way ordinary emergencies always did. She knocked twice and pushed the door open. He was sitting up in the bed, not lying down. The EKG leads were still attached, but the machine was quiet. His color was better than it had been in the parking lot. Someone had brought him coffee, which sat on the tray table half-finished, and he was looking at the window when she came in. He looked at her for a moment. "Rex?" he said. "Sutured. Antibiotics started. He's in Vehicle 3. They have him on a pad. Someone's with him." He let out a breath that had been waiting in his chest for a while. "Good." She pulled the chair up and sat down. "How do you feel?" "Like a man who drove 40 minutes with chest pain and didn't tell anyone." He said it without self-pity or performance, just fact. "You told Hendricks." "Eventually." She looked at his hands, folded on the blanket. The knuckles were enlarged in the way that came from years of cold and physical work, and there was a scar on the back of his left hand that was old enough to have gone silver. "You described what I said to Rex," she said, "when you called Vale." "Yes." "You knew what it meant." "I worked with K-9 units for 12 years, he said. "I know what a designation command sounds like. I know which programs use them." He looked at her steadily. "I wasn't trying to cause you problems." "I know." "I just wanted someone to know that the person who helped us knew what she was doing, so they'd understand what happened here." He paused. "And so they'd understand what was done to you for doing it." She sat with that for a moment. "They're going to have questions," she said, "about my history." "I know. It might get complicated." He looked at her with the particular patience of a man who had seen complicated things become more complicated and had learned that the only real variable was whether you were honest while it happened. "Did you do something wrong?" he said. She thought about the question carefully, not the way people thought about it when they were constructing a defense, the way she thought about things when she actually wanted to get to the bottom of them. "I made a decision," she said, "under pressure, with bad information. In a situation where there was no clean option, I made the best call I could." She paused. "Some people disagreed with it. Are those people right?" "No," she said. "Then it'll be fine." She almost said that things being right didn't always determine whether they were fine, but she'd spent enough time in enough difficult situations to know that this man understood that already, and saying it would just be noise. She stood up, checked the time. "I have to go answer some questions." "I know." He watched her move toward the door. "Kessler." She turned. "Thank you," he said, "for the floor." She understood what he meant, the act of sitting down on it, the choice to come down to Rex's level instead of expecting the dog to come up to hers. He needed help, she said. That was enough. She pulled the door shut behind her and walked back down the corridor, and when she reached the bottom of the stairs, the investigator was waiting with a laptop bag under his arm and the expression of a man who had spent the last 5 minutes reading something that had changed the shape of the afternoon. He turned the laptop toward her without saying anything. On the screen was a personnel file. Her photograph at the top, younger, hair different, in uniform. Below it, a service record, a list of deployments, redacted in places, a list of commendations with the classification level still attached, a list of assigned programs, the last of which had a flag on it, an internal review marker she recognized because she'd been in the room when the review was opened. She looked at the file for a long moment. "There's more," the investigator said. "That's just what they cleared me to show you." She looked up from the screen. "Who cleared you?" she said. He held her gaze. "The deputy director of the program asked me to show you this before our interview. She wanted you to know the scope of what we have." He paused. "And she wanted me to give you a message." "What message?" She said. He checked a notepad. "Tell her the review is being reopened. Tell her we found the other file." The air in the corridor went very still. Nora knew exactly which file. The one she'd submitted the night she left, the incident report. The one she'd written alone at 0300 with shaking hands and had sent through a secure channel to 3 separate addresses, none of which had ever acknowledged receipt. The one she'd spent 6 years assuming had disappeared. "She has it?" Nora said. "She has it," the investigator said, "and she needs you to come in." The corridor was quiet for a moment that had too much inside it. Nora looked at the investigator. His name was Brandt. He'd said it once and hadn't repeated it. And she thought about the file. Not the personnel record on the screen. The other one. The one she'd written at 0300 on a night that had ended a version of her life, sitting in a communications room with the door locked and her hands still unsteady from adrenaline, typing with the particular focus of someone who understood that the words they were writing needed to be precise because they might be the only record that existed of what had just happened. She'd sent it to 3 addresses. None had responded. She'd waited 2 weeks, then a month, then stopped waiting and started building the quiet life in Delwood instead. The apartment, the nursing job, the second-hand couch. 6 years. She'd assumed the file was gone. "Where did she find it?" Nora said. "I don't have that information," Brandt said. "What I know is that the deputy director wants to speak with you directly, and she asked me to make sure you understood the scope before we went into a formal interview." He paused. "She didn't want you walking into that room thinking you were exposed when I'm actually what?" He chose his words. "When the picture is more complete than you knew." She looked at the personnel file still on the screen. Her own face from 8 years ago looked back, younger, harder around the edges in a way that civilian life had softened without her noticing. "Schedule the call," she said, "after the formal interview." She anticipated that. "She's available from 2 o'clock. Nora checked her watch. It was 12:41. "Then let's not waste the hour," she said, and walked toward the conference room Brandt had indicated with a tilt of his head. The interview took 53 minutes. She answered every question fully and without hedging, which seemed to surprise Brandt and his colleague, a woman named Taft, who took notes by hand and asked the follow-up questions while Brandt ran the recorder. They'd expected resistance. They'd prepared for a subject who would answer narrowly, give the minimum, make them work for each piece. Instead, Nora sat across the table and told them the complete sequence. The morning's events from the moment she'd seen Wallace and Rex in the waiting room, the decision to help, what she'd said to Rex and why she'd known to say it, the termination, the parking lot, all of it. When they got to the program, the specific unit, the specific training methodology, the specific deployment history that explained her knowledge of K-9 designation commands, she answered that too. Not all of it. There were names she left out, not to protect herself, but because those names belonged to people who'd made their own choices about visibility and deserved the option of staying invisible. But the operational context, her own role, the timeline, she gave them all of it. When she was done, Brandt closed the recorder and looked at his notes. "The incident you reported in your exit file," he said, "the one the deputy director has located, you've never discussed it with anyone outside the program." "No." "Not with Vale?" "No. You went from active duty to a nursing program in 8 months. No gap year, no transitional support services, no contact with the program's exit counseling structure." "Correct." "Why nursing?" She thought about how to answer that accurately without giving him the version that sounded constructed. "Because the skills transferred, and because the work was real. You could see it, whether it was helping or not." She paused. "The program wasn't always like that." Taft looked up from her notepad. Brandt was quiet for a moment. "That's in the incident report. What you've just said." "I know." "Okay." He closed the folder. "We're going to need you available for a follow-up, possibly tomorrow, depending on what the deputy director determines after your call." "I'll be here." He started gathering materials, then stopped. "Ms. Kessler, for what it's worth, the footage review, the decision you made this morning about Sergeant Pruitt and the dog." He looked at her directly for the first time since the corridor. That was clear. She didn't thank him for it. It hadn't needed to be said, which meant he'd said it because he wanted to, not because it was part of the job. "I know," she said, and meant it differently than he probably heard it. Damn. While Nora was in that conference room, the morning's second track was accelerating without anyone's permission. Dana Forsyth's first post had reached 22,000 views by 12:30. By 1 o'clock, it was at 67,000, and 3 regional news affiliates had reached out for licensing rights to her parking lot footage. She'd posted a second clip at 12:48, the exterior shot of Wallace being moved on a gurney, Rex visible through the hospital's glass doors, the black SUVs arranged in the parking lot behind, and that one had moved faster. Comment sections were running hard. Veterans forums, military family groups, local Montana networks. The framing had already calcified into something simple and emotional, the way these things did online when the actual story was complicated enough to resist nuance but legible enough to produce outrage. By 1:15, the story had cleared regional and landed on a national wire service. Preston Hale found out about the wire service from his communications director, who called at 1:17 to inform him that she was getting media inquiry calls and needed a statement approved within the hour, or she was going to issue a holding statement on her own authority, which Hale had previously told her she did not have. Hale called Boyle. Boyle didn't answer. Copte. Harrison Boyle was in his car in the hospital's staff parking structure when Hale's call came through. He saw the name on the screen and put the phone face down on the passenger seat. He'd been in the car for 20 minutes, not going anywhere, just sitting, with the engine off and the parking structure's concrete ceiling close overhead, doing the arithmetic he'd been avoiding all morning. The board had called at 11:43. The conversation had been 12 minutes long, during which the board's legal liaison had used the phrases preliminary inquiry, potential regulatory review, and personnel decision under examination in a sequence that made the direction of travel unmistakable. They hadn't told him he was suspended, they hadn't told him anything formal, but 12-minute calls from board legal liaisons that included the word examination were not calls that ended with someone's career intact. He picked up his phone and looked at it. 19 missed calls, 7 voicemails, hail twice, legal once, 3 numbers he didn't recognize, 2 from colleagues whose names he knew, and 1 from the Medical Licensing Board's regional office, which had called at 12:52 and left a voicemail he hadn't listened to yet. He pressed play. The voicemail was 42 seconds long, formal, precise, delivered by a woman whose voice carried the particular flatness of someone reading from a prepared script. Dr. Boyle, this is the Montana State Medical Licensing Board. We are initiating a review of a complaint filed this morning regarding events at Carver Regional Medical Center. We would ask that you contact our office by close of business today. This review is preliminary in nature and does not constitute a finding or sanction. However, your cooperation at this stage is strongly encouraged. He lowered the phone. Through the concrete walls, he could hear nothing of the parking lot, nothing of the hospital, nothing of the 4 military vehicles, and the reporter across the road, and the 67,000 people who had watched a clip of his parking lot by lunchtime. All of that was out there, and in here there was just the closed car, and the overhead light, and the 42-second message he was going to have to listen to again. He called the licensing board back at 1:24. The call lasted 6 minutes. He was told that a formal complaint had been filed by the Department of Defense, citing the treatment of a retired military working animal and its owner, and that a secondary complaint had been filed by the hospital's own nursing union on behalf of a terminated employee. The nursing union, he said. Filed at 11:45 this morning, the representative said. He hadn't known the nursing staff had a union rep on site. He'd known there was a union. It was in the documents he'd signed when he took the attending position, but he'd never had occasion to interact with it, and had, if he was honest, operated with the assumption that it was largely administrative. It was not largely administrative. What does the secondary complaint allege? He said. Retaliatory termination following a good faith patient care action, the representative said. The complaint includes a witness declaration from 3 members of the nursing staff. 3 members, who had been in that waiting room, had watched the whole thing, and had apparently gone to the union rep within 2 hours of Nora walking out with her box. Boyle ended the call and sat in the parking structure for another 11 minutes without moving. At 1:58, Nora was in the small staff lounge near the second-floor conference room, waiting for the 2 o'clock call, when the door opened and Vail came in. He had 2 coffees, which he'd gotten from somewhere, and he set one in front of her without asking if she wanted it. Forsyth's story is on the wire, he said. I heard. It's going national. The veteran angle is what pushed it. He sat across from her, not beside her this time. Across. Wallace's service record is the kind of thing that writes the headline for you. He didn't want this. No. He wanted help for his dog. Vail looked at his coffee. He got this instead. He's not happy about it for what it's worth. He told Hendricks twice that he didn't ask for cameras. He wouldn't. No. He paused. The story's out now. The question is what shape it takes. She understood what he meant. There was the version of the story that was already forming online, the veteran, the dog, the hospital's failure, the nurse who helped and got fired. And that version was emotionally true without being fully accurate, because it was missing the parts of Nora's history that changed its shape significantly. The missing parts were the program, the incident report, the 6 years of deliberate disappearance. Those parts were not going to stay missing. The deputy director call, she said. What do you know about it? More than I told you earlier. He held her gaze. The file you submitted, the incident report. It wasn't lost. It was deliberately withheld. Someone inside the program at the time flagged it for review and then routed it into an internal hold status that effectively buried it. He paused. That someone retired 2 years ago. When the deputy director did her transition audit, she found it in a secondary archive. Nora went very still. "Who?" she said. "I'm going to let her tell you that on the call." He said it carefully, not to protect himself from her reaction, but because he thought she deserved to hear it from the right person. "What I'll tell you is that the decision to bury it wasn't about protecting the program. It was about protecting one specific operation that the report had implicated, an operation that has since been formally closed, and 2 of its principals have since been disciplined." "Since," she said. "As in, after I left." "After you left. And if my report had gone through channels the way it was supposed to, the timeline would have been shorter," he said, "and you would have had, potentially, a different set of choices." She looked at the table. The coffee she hadn't touched was putting a ring on the surface where the laminate was lifting slightly at the edge. Old table, tired furniture, a room that got used for small, uncomfortable conversations, and not much else. "I gave up 4 years," she said. "The unit, the work, the people in it, because the report disappeared and I thought the program wasn't—" She stopped. "I thought they weren't interested in the truth." "I know." They were. The deputy director was. She didn't have the authority at that stage that she has now. What happened to your report was not her decision and not her knowledge. He looked at her directly. "She's been looking for a way to reopen it for 18 months. Your situation this morning gave her the procedural basis." Nora thought about that. About the complicated arithmetic of institutional timelines. The way things that should have happened in 2 weeks could take 6 years. Not from malice, but from the ordinary dysfunction of large organizations where information moved in wrong directions, and the right person didn't have authority, and the wrong person did. It didn't make her feel better, exactly, but it made the shape of the last 6 years different. Not wasted, just detoured. Her phone buzzed. 2 o'clock exactly. She looked at Vale. "Give me the room," she said. He took his coffee and left without a word. The call lasted 31 minutes. The deputy director's name was Elaine Marsh, and she had a voice that was measured without being cold and direct without being aggressive. And in 31 minutes, she told Nora 3 things that reorganized the last 6 years into something with different edges. The first was the name of the person who had buried the report. It was someone Nora had worked with. Not a supervisor, a lateral colleague, someone she'd trusted and had not had reason to distrust until now. She sat with that information for approximately 10 seconds, which was about as long as she could afford to sit with it, and then she moved on. The second was that the incident the report described, the operation that had gone wrong, the decision Nora had made under pressure with incomplete information, had been independently investigated, and her account had been corroborated by 2 separate sources who came forward after the fact. She had not made an error. The error had been made above her, and the consequences had been directed at her, which was a pattern the investigation had documented. The third thing was a question. "I want to offer you a formal review process," Marsh said. "Full reinstatement review, record correction, public acknowledgement of the error. It won't be a small process. It'll take time, and it will be visible." She paused. "But I want to know, before we go further, whether you want that. Some people don't. Some people left for reasons that go beyond what happened that night, and I don't want to pull you back into visibility if that's not what you want." Nora looked at the wall. At the window beyond it, gray sky, the edge of the parking structure, a slice of the lot where one of the black SUVs was still parked. "I want the record corrected," she said, "whatever that requires." "Okay," Marsh said. "Then we start today." By 3:30, the hospital was a different place than it had been at 7 that morning. Not visibly, from the outside. Same building, same entrance, same parking lot with the same gray sky overhead. But the internal structure had shifted the way structures shifted when enough pressure was applied to the right points. Preston Hale had convened an emergency board call at 2:15, during which the board's legal team had presented a preliminary finding that the termination of Nora Kessler had been procedurally improper and potentially tortious, and had recommended immediate reversal pending formal review. Hale had agreed without argument, which was itself a signal. Preston Hale did not agree to things without argument as a rule. The reversal was documented at 2:43 and communicated to HR, who sent the formal notification to the email address on Nora's file at 2:51. She read it in the staff lounge without visible reaction. Hendricks knocked on the door at 3 o'clock and told her that Rex had been moved inside, to a supply room off the main corridor that someone had cleared and padded, which was not standard protocol, and was entirely the kind of improvisation that happened when a Brigadier General was in the building and had expressed that he wanted the dog comfortable. Rex was sleeping, which Reyes said was the best possible outcome for his recovery trajectory. His vitals were stable, the sutures were holding. Wallace had been told about Rex's status and had, according to Hendricks, said good, and then asked for more coffee, which Hendricks had taken as a positive indicator. Nora went to see Rex at 3:15. The supply room was quiet and warm, and Rex was on the padded surface with his bandaged leg extended and his eyes half open in the particular state that working dogs occupied between sleep and alertness. He tracked her when she came in. He didn't move, but his ears adjusted. She sat on the floor beside the padding. He put his nose against the back of her hand again. Same as the waiting room, brief, deliberate. She didn't move for a few minutes, just sat there with the dog and the quiet room and the sound of the hospital going about its afternoon outside the door. At 4 o'clock, Dana Forsyth's second story went up. Not a clip this time, a full article with the wire service's resources behind it. It carried the headline, Decorated Veteran, Military K-9 left in hospital waiting room, nurse terminated for rendering aid. It had Wallace's service record, the timeline of the morning, the board's preliminary reversal of the termination, and a quote from Brigadier General Vale, the first time Vale had allowed his name to be attached to anything, which told Nora something about how far Marsh had decided to move. The article also had a paragraph near the bottom that was short and did not carry a quote, but which stated that the Department of Defense had confirmed a formal review of the nurse's personnel record was underway in connection with a previously filed incident report. That paragraph ran 4 sentences and contained almost no specific information. Within 2 hours, it had been screenshotted and shared more than any other part of the article because people had the instinct for the part of a story that was the actual story, even when the actual story was still being told. By 5 o'clock, Harrison Boyle had retained a private attorney. By 5:30, the Montana State Medical Licensing Board had upgraded its inquiry from preliminary to formal. By 6, 3 separate members of the hospital nursing staff had given on-record statements to Forsyth. None of them used their names, but 2 of them described in specific terms what they had witnessed in the waiting room, the dog's injury, Nora's response, Boyle's arrival, the termination, and the third described, more generally, a pattern of administrative decisions under Boyle's attending tenure that prioritized documentation over patient care in ways that had been quietly discussed among nursing staff for months, but never formally raised. Nora heard about the third statement from Taft, who came by the lounge at 6:15 with an update, and she sat with it in a way she hadn't expected to. Not satisfaction, something quieter and less comfortable than satisfaction. The knowledge that the problem had been visible to people who worked around it for a long time, which meant the problem had been real for longer than one morning. Vale found her at 6:40, back in the corridor near Wallace's room. "The board wants to meet with you tomorrow morning," he said. "Formal session. They're requesting your presence." As a witness or as a subject? Neither. As the person whose situation has initiated what is becoming a fairly significant review of the hospital's operational protocols. He paused. Hale's description, not mine. What does Hale want from the meeting? I think he wants to apologize in a setting that is documented, Vale said, which is the kind of apology that is also a liability management strategy. I know. You don't have to go. She thought about it. I'll go. He nodded. Marsh's team will be sending paperwork tonight for the formal reinstatement review. It's going to require your signature on several things, some of which are going to be uncomfortable to read. I know. The name of the person who buried the report is going to be in the paperwork. Yes. She looked down the corridor at the closed door of Wallace's room. Does that person know the review is being reopened? As of about 2 hours ago, yes. Good, she said, and meant it with a specificity that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with clarity. Vale looked at her for a moment. You're handling this well. I'm not, actually, she said. I'm just doing it anyway. He almost said something, decided against it, which was its own kind of answer. She started toward the corridor. Kessler. He used her last name the way he had in the parking lot. She stopped. The board meeting tomorrow. They're going to ask you about your plans. Going forward. They'll want to know if you intend to return to Carver Regional. She considered it. The waiting room floor, the locker with its half-eaten granola bar, and the note from a patient who hadn't signed their name. The coworkers who'd watched her walk out. I don't know yet, she said honestly. There may be other options on the table, he said, after the reinstatement review. I know. I'm not pushing. I know that too. She looked at him. Let me get through tomorrow first. She walked back toward the stairs, and behind her she heard Vale's footsteps move in the opposite direction, back toward the lobby and the SUVs and the logistics of a situation that was going to require managing through the night. The corridor was quiet. The hospital's evening shift had taken over, and the daytime energy had flattened into the lower register of hospitals after dark. Quieter, more purposeful, fewer people moving with the ambient stress of the day. She was almost at the stairwell door when her phone buzzed. Not a call. An email. From an address she didn't recognize, with a subject line that contained only a case number, a format she recognized from a long time ago. Program Internal Communications. The case number was the one attached to the incident report, her incident report. She opened it. The email was 3 sentences. The secondary file has been recovered and authenticated. The third witness account is on record as of 1600 today. You should know, there is a 4th name in the original operational log that was not in your report because you didn't have access to it at the time. She read it twice. There was no name below the email, no sender identification, just the case number and the 3 sentences and the particular weight of information that was not yet complete. A 4th name. Someone involved in the operation who she hadn't known about, whose existence in the log, recovered now, meant that the operation had been more deliberately constructed than she'd understood when she was inside it, and that someone had made sure she didn't have the full picture while she was making the decision that had ended her career. She stood in the stairwell doorway with the phone in her hand and understood that what she'd thought was the end of the day's revelations was not, in fact, the end. She stood in the stairwell for 2 minutes without moving. The 4th name. Someone in the operational log who had not been in her report because she hadn't known to look for them, which meant the decision to send her unit into that situation without complete information had not been an oversight. Someone had constructed the incomplete picture deliberately, had made sure she was making a call she couldn't fully evaluate because she was missing a variable she didn't know existed. She forwarded the email to Brandt's contact address with no subject line and no message attached. He would understand what it meant. And then she went upstairs, because she had told Vale she would get through tomorrow first, and tomorrow started with enough hours of sleep to be functional. And being functional had always been how she moved through things that were too large to process while they were still happening. She did not sleep well. She slept enough. Mtichik. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock and started at 9:14, which Nora noted not out of irritation, but because the 14-minute delay told her something about the morning's energy inside Carver Regional before she'd even walked into the room. The room was a formal conference space on the 3rd floor. Long table, 8 chairs, a wall of windows looking out over the hospital's north face, and a stretch of Montana sky that was doing something complicated with clouds. 4 board members were present in person, 2 on a video screen. The hospital's legal counsel sat at the far end with a laptop and a yellow legal pad, and the expression of someone who had been awake since 4. Preston Hale sat midway down the table. He looked like a man who had aged 6 months in the previous 18 hours, which was the particular aging that came not from physical strain, but from the specific stress of understanding, too late, the magnitude of what you'd failed to prevent. Nora sat where they indicated, across from Hale, and she put her hands flat on the table in front of her because it was a habit from rooms like this. Not a deliberate posture, just something her body defaulted to when it understood it was in a formal assessment environment. The board chair, a woman named Geraldine Forsmark, who had the measured deliberateness of someone who had run difficult meetings for decades, opened by stating the purpose: review of the personnel action taken the previous day, assessment of relevant protocols, and determination of next steps. What followed was not the apology as liability management that Vale had predicted, or not only that. Forcemark ran it with a directness that was harder to manage than either defense or deference. She asked Hale to walk through the decision sequence. He did, without embellishment, and the walking through of it made it sound exactly as bad as it had been, because the facts, stated plainly, did not require editorial comment to carry their weight. He had been informed that a nurse had used hospital supplies to render aid to a patient's animal. He had signed termination paperwork without reviewing footage. He had not asked whether the veteran or the animal had any status that would affect the hospital's obligations. He had not asked the nurse a single question. "Did you speak with Ms. Kessler at any point before the termination was processed?" Forcemark asked. "No," Hale said. The room absorbed that. "Did Dr. Boyle speak with her beyond the immediate exchange in the waiting room?" "Not to my knowledge." So the termination decision was based solely on Dr. Boyle's account of what he observed. Yes. Forcemark wrote something on her notepad. "Thank you, Mr. Hale." Then she turned to Nora, and the meeting shifted register. "Ms. Kessler, what would you like the board to know?" Nora had thought about this since 6:45 the previous evening. She'd thought about what she could say that would be useful versus what would simply be the expression of feelings she had a right to, but which wouldn't move anything forward. "The veteran in your waiting room had a cardiac event developing while staff argued about a dog," she said. "That's the core of what happened here. Not my background, not the military connection, not what ended up online. A man sat in a chair for an hour with chest tightness, and nobody did a complete intake because the dog was the problem everyone focused on." She paused. "I want the board to address that, not as a response to what's happened publicly, but because it's the thing that could kill someone next time." Forcemark looked at her for a moment. "And your own situation?" "I'd like my record corrected. I'd like the termination reversed formally, not just procedurally. And I'd like the nursing staff who filed the union complaint to know that their action was appropriate and that there should be no informal consequence for it. You're concerned about retaliation against those staff members." "I've seen institutional retaliation work quietly before," Nora said. "I want it documented that any such action would be taken seriously." Forcemark wrote again. "Those are reasonable requests. We can address them formally." Legal counsel at the end of the table was typing. Boyle was not at the board meeting. He was, at that same hour, in a different kind of room. The Montana State Medical Licensing Board's formal inquiry had convened at 8:30 in a state office building 12 miles from Carver Regional, and Boyle sat across from two licensing board investigators with his attorney beside him, and the particular stillness of a man who understood that what was happening in this room was real in a way that the previous day's events had not yet fully been. The inquiry ran through the footage, frame by frame in places, with a clinical attention to each decision point. Boyle's arrival in the waiting room, his exchange with Nora, the instruction to Dr. Sanders, a second physician who had been present and had not intervened, the termination, its speed, its basis. His attorney objected 3 times. Each objection was noted, and the question was asked again in a slightly different form. What became clear through the 2-hour proceeding, not through any dramatic revelation, but through the steady accumulation of documented facts, was that Boyle's decision had not been an isolated lapse. The investigators had pulled 18 months of incident reports from Carver Regional. In that period, there were 6 documented cases where nursing staff had flagged patient care concerns and been formally or informally discouraged from escalating. 3 of those flags had been signed off by the attending physician on duty. Boyle's name appeared on 2 of them. The pattern was not explosive. It was mundane, which made it in some ways worse. The everyday suppression of people doing their jobs correctly, not through malice exactly, but through the institutional confidence of someone who had never been seriously questioned and had stopped distinguishing between his authority and his judgment. By 10:30, the licensing board had enough to move from inquiry to formal investigation. Boyle's practicing privileges at Carver Regional were suspended pending the investigation's completion. His attorney said, "We understand," and began gathering papers. Boyle walked out of the state office building into the October cold and stood on the sidewalk for a moment before his attorney joined him. "How long?" Boyle said. "The investigation? 6 months minimum. Could be longer." "And the hospital?" "That's separate." What the board does and what Carver does are separate tracks. Boyle looked at the sky. I thought I was following protocol. His attorney was quiet for a second, which was more honest than agreement would have been. Harrison, he said, protocol isn't the issue they're looking at. Bolts. By 11, Forsyth had the licensing board suspension on record and had posted it with a 3-paragraph update. The story's comments had passed 40,000. Veterans organizations had issued 2 statements. A state senator had called for a review of hospital protocols statewide. The Montana Nursing Association had released a statement in support of Nora's reinstatement that used the word unconscionable 3 times in 6 sentences. Nora read none of it in real time. She was with Wallace. His discharge was scheduled for noon. The cardiologist had cleared him. The stress-induced cardiac strain had not progressed. His markers had stabilized overnight, and the recommended course was rest, hydration, a cardiology follow-up in 2 weeks, and the instruction delivered with the careful tone of someone who knew they were talking to a man who would nod and then do whatever he judged necessary to avoid unnecessary physical strain for the next month. Wallace had nodded. He was dressed when Nora came in. Same clothes as yesterday. The flannel shirt with the missing sleeve, because someone had collected his bag from the truck, but hadn't thought to bring a replacement shirt. And Wallace had declined the offer of a hospital spare. Rex was on the floor beside the bed. He'd been brought up from the supply room an hour earlier, which had required a small argument with a floor administrator who cited hygiene protocols, and which had ended when Hendricks said quietly that the dog was a retired military working animal, and the administrator had looked at the people in the room and decided the argument wasn't worth continuing. Rex's bandaged leg was extended. He looked better, steadier. The shock of the previous day metabolized. When Nora came in, he tracked her and his ears moved. "Ready?" she said. "Past ready," Wallace said. He stood without assistance, which took a moment, and Rex stood with him. She walked them down herself. Not because it was required, she wasn't technically on shift. Her return had been processed, but formally started Monday, but because she wanted to. The elevator, the ground floor corridor, the automatic doors, the parking lot where the morning was cold and clear and the black SUVs were gone, replaced by Wallace's truck, which someone had moved to the pickup area. Vale was there. He'd stayed the night in a hotel 2 miles away and come back at 7, which Nora hadn't asked him to do and which she understood was not entirely about the logistics. He and Wallace looked at each other across the truck bed, and what passed between them was the compressed communication of people who had operated in the same world for a long time. Acknowledgement, respect, the particular recognition of 2 people who had both spent their lives making hard decisions in difficult conditions and carrying the weight of them without complaint. "Rex," Vale said. Rex looked at him with the serious yellow-brown eyes and then looked away, which Vale seemed to accept. Wallace put his hand out. Vale shook it. "Thank you for coming," Wallace said. "You shouldn't have needed to call," Vale said. Wallace nodded once. Not agreement, exactly. Something more like the acceptance of a man who had long since stopped expecting the systems around him to work correctly and had learned to manage within that reality. He turned to Nora. She expected him to say something formal. A thank you, an acknowledgement, the closure-shaped language that situations like this tended to produce. Instead, he looked at her for a moment the way he'd looked at her from the chair in the waiting room, measuring, patient, with the specific attention of someone for whom reading people had been a survival skill. "You gonna be okay?" he said. She almost deflected. It was her first instinct, the compact self-sufficiency of someone who had spent years not being asked that question by anyone who meant it. "I think so," she said. "It'll take a while." "It usually does." He opened the truck door. Rex climbed in with the careful 3-legged movement of an animal managing an injury with more dignity than most people managed much smaller discomforts. Wallace got in after him. He looked at her through the open window. "The floor," he said. That was the thing. She understood what he meant. Not just the act, but the choice behind it. That she'd gone down to the dog's level instead of requiring the dog to come up to hers. That she'd treated the situation as it was, rather than as protocol said it should be. "Take care of him," she said. "Always have," he said, and drove out of the lot. The 4th name came through official channels at 2 in the afternoon. Brant called, not emailed, which told her the information was being handled carefully. He asked her to come to the conference room, and she did. And when she got there, Taft was also present, and there was a third person she hadn't met, a woman in her 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of steady presence that filled a room without performing anything. "Ms. Kessler," the woman said, "I'm Elaine Marsh." She'd known the voice from the call. Seeing the person attached to it was a different thing. Marsh was someone who looked like what she'd built, which was an organization that had made significant errors and was in the process of accounting for them, and she carried that without collapsing under it. They shook hands. "The fourth name," Nora said. "Sit down," Marsh said, not unkindly. She sat. The fourth name was a man named Gerald Ott, who had been a senior program coordinator 6 years ago, not Nora's direct chain of command, but operational oversight, 2 levels above the unit, with access to intelligence that the unit itself did not receive in full. He had been in the operational log of the incident because he had approved the mission parameters, the parameters that contained a specific intelligence gap that Nora's incident report had identified as deliberate. Ott had retired 3 years ago with a clean record. He was 61 years old, living in Colorado, drawing a federal pension. "The incident report named the gap," Marsh said. "Your report said the intelligence provided to your unit had been selectively edited. What you didn't know, because you didn't have access to the source documents, was that the editing occurred at Ott's level, with his authorization, because the full intelligence picture would have prevented the operation from being approved. He needed the mission to proceed. The edited briefing made that possible." Nora was quiet for a moment. "The decision I made that night was based on deliberately incomplete information," Marsh said. "The review has confirmed this. Your incident report was accurate. The action you took was consistent with the information you had access to and would have been different if you'd had the full picture." "Different how?" "You wouldn't have gone in." She sat with that. 6 years of carrying a decision that had felt right and felt wrong simultaneously, the specific exhaustion of not being certain whether you'd been brave or reckless. And the answer was that the question itself had been built on a corrupted foundation. She hadn't had the variables to make the calculation correctly. Someone had made sure of that. "What happens to Ott?" she said. "Federal review is being initiated. His pension and record are subject to that review." Marsh held her gaze. "This is not going to be fast. I know how these things move. It will be thorough." A pause. "And it will be documented publicly at the completion of the review. And the person who buried my report has already submitted a formal statement acknowledging the action. They will be subject to review." Marsh said it without softening it. "I want you to know I can't undo what happened. I can correct it forward. That's what I'm doing." Nora looked at the table, at the window, at the Montana sky outside, which had gone entirely clear while she was in the room, the complicated clouds of the morning replaced by something simple and flat and very blue. "I want my record corrected," she said. "I want the incident report filed correctly, in the record, as submitted. I want the review findings documented and preserved. Done. And I want the nursing staff here, the 3 who gave statements, to have formal documentation that their action was appropriate and protected. I'll coordinate that with the hospital board this afternoon." Nora nodded. There was one more thing, and it was the thing she'd been circling since the stairwell the previous evening. "The work I did," she said, "before I left. The unit, the program." Marsh looked at her. "It was good work," Nora said. "Most of it. The parts that weren't mine." "I know," Marsh said. "I want that on record, too." "It will be." They looked at each other across the table, 2 women who had operated inside large institutions that had failed them in specific ways and who had, by different routes and with different costs, arrived at the point of deciding what to do about it. "There's an offer coming," Marsh said. "Formally, through channels, next week. I wanted to tell you it was coming so you had time to think." "What offer?" "Medical integration? A new program we're building. Trauma-trained medical personnel working with active K-9 units and their handlers. The gap you filled yesterday, with Rex, is a documented gap in our operational structure. We've known it for 2 years and haven't found the right architecture for it." She paused. "You are, apparently, a significant part of the right architecture. I'm a nurse in Delwood, Montana. You're a combat medic with K-9 integration training who has spent 14 months in a civilian trauma setting, Marsh said. That combination doesn't exist anywhere else in our roster. I'm not asking you to go back to what you were. I'm asking you to consider something that hasn't existed before. Nora was quiet. Think about it, Marsh said. You have time. The board's formal session ended at 4 with a unanimous vote to reverse the termination, formally censure the decision-making process, and initiate a protocol review covering all emergency patient intake procedures at Carver Regional. The censure included Hale's signature, which was not legally required and which he signed anyway. Nora had heard from Force Mark that Hale had requested it be included, which was the kind of detail that didn't change what had happened but told you something about where the man was landing. Boyle's suspension from practicing privileges was posted on the licensing board's public record at 4:30. By 5, it had been picked up by the wire service. By 6, it was in Forsyth's update, with a follow-on piece that included the 18-month pattern of suppressed nursing complaints. That piece ran under Forsyth's byline and above the fold of the online edition, and it was carefully reported, no editorializing, just the documented sequence, the complaint history. The board's findings stated accurately. It was the kind of journalism that didn't need to reach for language because the facts reached far enough on their own. The nursing staff who had filed the union complaint received formal written protection documentation from the board's legal office before end of business. Nora made sure of that before she left the building at 5:42. What? She drove home through Delwood in the early evening, when the light was low and the mountains to the west were doing something complicated with the last of the sun. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it the previous morning. Coffee mug in the drying rack, secondhand couch, the photograph of her sister's kids she'd taken back from the cardboard box and set on the kitchen counter. She stood in the middle of the apartment for a while. It was a small life, as lives went. Carefully constructed, deliberately contained. She'd built it that way on purpose. Small enough that nothing inside it could be taken away in a way that mattered. Small enough to be safe. She thought about what Marsh had said. The offer that was coming. The work that hadn't existed before. She thought about Rex on the supply room floor, nose against the back of her hand. About Wallace in the chair with his one-sleeved shirt, and his patience and the way he'd said, "I know," when she told him they wouldn't help. About the note in her locker. Thank you for listening. No name. The patient who hadn't expected to be heard and had felt, briefly, that they were. She sat on the couch. The thing about a carefully small life was that it worked as far as it went. It was survivable, but it didn't go far. And the distance it didn't go was the distance between surviving and the other thing, the thing that made the work feel like work and not just occupation. She'd had that other thing once, before the program, before the incident, before the decision made in the dark with bad information and shaking hands. She'd had it in the field, in the work, in the specific satisfaction of doing something difficult correctly. She'd had a version of it in the waiting room yesterday morning, on the floor with Rex and the saline and the gauze. She'd felt it again when she sat with Wallace before the investigators and told him it would be fine, and meant it in the specific way that required having evidence. She called her sister. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, which was what happened when her sister was putting the kids to bed. "It's me," she said. "I'm okay. I'll explain later. It's a long story." She paused. A really long story. She set the phone down. She thought about the offer for another hour. Then she stopped thinking about it the way she'd been thinking about it, as a decision to be analyzed, and let herself just know what she already knew, which was that the small life had been what she needed for a while and was no longer what she needed, and that the program Marsh was building was the kind of work she was actually built for, and that staying small to stay safe was only worth doing if you were actually safer for it. And she wasn't, and hadn't been for some time. She picked up her phone and emailed Marsh's contact address. "I'll read the formal offer when it comes. I'm open to it." She sent it before she could edit it into something more measured. The licensing board's investigation of Gerald Ott was initiated 8 days later and took 7 months to complete. Its findings, made public upon completion, documented the deliberate editing of operational intelligence materials, the authorization of a mission based on a falsified picture of conditions, and the subsequent burial of an incident report that would have initiated the review process 6 years earlier. Ott's federal pension was suspended pending civil proceedings. His record was amended. The colleague who had buried Nora's report, the lateral colleague she'd trusted, whose name she still didn't say aloud easily, was formally censured and removed from the program. He wrote her a letter. She read it once, then put it in a drawer. She wasn't ready for that part. She thought she might be, eventually. Dr. Harrison Boyle's formal licensing board investigation concluded 4 months after the events at Carver Regional. His practicing privileges were reinstated with conditions: mandatory review of a protocol compliance course, a 2-year probationary monitoring period, and a formal letter of reprimand that became part of his permanent licensing record. He did not return to Carver Regional. He took a position at a smaller facility in a different county where, according to what Nora heard through Hendricks, he had become noticeably more careful about asking questions before making decisions, which was a change that probably should have happened earlier and was nonetheless a change. Preston Hale implemented the protocol review in full. It took 3 months and involved every department, and the resulting new intake procedures included specific provisions for veteran patients and working animals, and a formal escalation pathway for nursing staff concerns that didn't route through the attending physician. The pathway was boring and bureaucratic and the kind of thing that nobody would ever hear about publicly. It would save someone, eventually. That was how these things worked. The 3 nursing staff members who had filed the union complaint stayed at Carver Regional. 2 of them received formal commendations in the board's final report. The third asked that her name not be attached to anything public, and that was respected. Wallace sent Nora a photograph 6 weeks later. Rex, standing on all 4 legs in bright sunlight in what looked like a backyard, the bandage long gone, looking at the camera with the same serious, watchful expression he brought to everything. On the back of the photograph, actual paper, mailed in an actual envelope, which said something about Wallace, he'd written, "He's good. We're good. Thank you for the floor." She put it next to the photograph of her sister's kids on the kitchen counter. She started with Marcia's program in January, which gave her 2 months to wind down the Delwood apartment and transfer her nursing credentials and have a conversation with her sister that was, as promised, a very long story. Her sister listened to all of it without interrupting, which was how she'd always listened, and at the end she said, "I wondered when you were going to stop hiding," and Nora didn't argue with the word because it was accurate. The work was harder than civilian nursing and more complicated than the program had been, and there were days when it was frustrating in new and specific ways she hadn't anticipated, and there were days when it was exactly what she'd known it would be, the work she was built for, in conditions where it mattered, with the particular clarity that came from doing something difficult correctly. On the second week, she met the unit's K-9 team for the first time. 3 dogs, 3 handlers. The dogs assessed her with the serious attention that working dogs gave to new people. Not hostility, just cataloging. The first one pressed his nose against the back of her hand. She crouched down to his level, which was not a technique or a protocol. It was just the right way to meet someone where they were. Here is what this story is actually about. It isn't about the military connection, or the footage, or the investigation. Those are the machinery. The story is about what happens to people who do the right thing in the wrong room, who see clearly and act correctly, and get punished for it by systems that have confused their own rules with their own purpose. It is about the particular cost of being competent in a context that cannot recognize you, and about the longer, slower work of waiting for the context to catch up. Not because waiting is easy, but because the truth has a way of becoming visible eventually, if you don't destroy yourself trying to force it into view before it's ready. Nora didn't save Wallace and Rex because she wanted recognition. She did it because it needed doing, and she was the person present who knew how. She got fired for it by people who were measuring the situation against a checklist instead of against what was actually in front of them. And then, because the truth was true, regardless of whether anyone acknowledged it, it surfaced. Not cleanly, not all at once. In pieces, through channels, with friction and delay, and the ordinary dysfunction of large institutions doing uncomfortable self-examination. But it surfaced. The people who underestimated her were not stupid. They were operating inside a structure that rewarded a particular kind of judgment and had never required them to revise it. When revision was forced, some of them did it badly, and some of them did it better than expected. That is what people do. The people who buried her report were not abstract villains. They were people who had something to protect and made choices to protect it at someone else's expense. That is also what people do. What Nora did, what carries across all of it, was refuse to let the wrong judgment of a bad day become the definition of who she was. She built a small life and she lived in it, and she waited, not passively but functionally, until the moment when doing the right thing was again available to her, and then she did it. That is not a small thing. In the specific circumstances of any given bad morning, it is the whole thing. The floor mattered, not as symbol, as choice. She went down to where Rex was instead of requiring him to come up to where she was. That is, when you remove everything else, the entire story, the willingness to meet the situation at its level, without waiting for the situation to rearrange itself into something more convenient. She did not get a perfect ending. Her record was corrected and her career was restored, and the people who harmed her were held to account. And she also spent 6 years in a small apartment in Montana and carries a night she'll never stop thinking about, and has a drawer with a letter in it she's not ready to open. That is what justice actually looks like. Not the clean version, but the real one, where the accounts are settled and the damage remains, and you build forward from where you are rather than from where you should have been. She chose the floor. Everything else followed from that.